Hello and welcome to a completely non-standard voiceover only video. It is just that kind of week and I will not be taking questions at this time. So there was a bit of discussion last week in my crafting Discord server about variegated threads, how exactly you're supposed to stitch with them and what effect different methods would give. Everybody seemed to think this was a good video idea, and frankly anything that I can record and edit in a single day is fine by me. So, variegated threads, what do they do? Are they a faff? Let's find out. You can see here I've already stitched up some examples, and the floss I have used for this is DMC Coloris, or Coloris if you are an uneducated British person like myself. Specifically, this is colorway 4514. I don't personally own many variegated threads, I'll be honest. This whole skein is going spare because it has a weird breakage issue where sections just keep sort of disintegrating. I got my money back, I've used other DMC variegated since, and nobody I asked had ever seen anything like it, so long story short, do not let my experience scare you off if you think it's a pretty colorway. Of course, there are lots of other brands and styles of variegated floss. Many of them will have much more subtle colour changes than this one, or some of them will just vary between different shades of the same colour, so naturally that is going to massively affect your outcome. But hopefully you can get an idea of the options from this video, and then you can go away and see which works best with your particular project. Okay, so if all you want is to see an example of the different stitching methods, you know what, I will just label this for you now and you can get on with your day. But if you would like a bit more detail and some tips and tricks, do stick around for the full breakdown. First up then, if we look at how the floss comes straight from the skein, the colour changes are consistent across all 6 strands. So for this first method, when you thread your needle, and in this case I used 2 strands, you want to make sure you keep those colour changes lined up and one strand isn't starting further along in the colour repeat than the other. For this first block, I kept things simple. I started at the top left and completed one full cross stitch at a time, working back and forth in rows. This is not how I would normally stitch with regular floss, but we'll get to that in a minute. What you'll notice this does is it creates a roughly striped effect with very clearly defined chunks of each colour. Now, if you were stitching a section of a different size, you'll end up with a different look. For example, if you did a section that was much longer than this, then we can see each colour section is quite small, so you'd get multiple colour changes across the row, rather than just the 1 or 2 we have here. On the second block here, I kept the 2 strands, colour changes matched up as before, and the plan was to start at the exact same place in the colour repeat so we could directly compare these 2 blocks, but yeah, remember what I said about this skein having weird breakage issues? So here I reverted to my preferred way of stitching, which is to complete a row with just one leg of the stitch and then come back the other way to do the other leg. Obviously with a solid colour this ends up looking the exact same as the previous method, but here it does make quite a difference. You'll notice that on the right side of the block the stitches look fairly normal, and that's because I was ending on the right side of each row before doubling back, so I obviously completed those stitches soon after laying down that first leg. But on the left side, because there was a much bigger gap between laying down the first and second legs, they're often a completely different colour. It's a really cool effect in its own right, losing those defined chunks of colour from the first block, but helping each colour blend together much better instead. Again, your mileage may vary depending on your specific thread, the size of the area you're stitching, etc, etc. If you don't want the solid colour effect on one side, you could alternate which way you complete each row. That might be a fun experiment, and I wish I'd thought of it earlier. Moving on then. One very popular stitching method with regular floss is the loop start. This is where instead of working with 2 strands, you'll work with one long strand folded in half. But of course, if we fold one of these strands in half, the colour repeat no longer matches. So this is what that looks like when you stitch one complete cross stitch at a time, one row at a time, but with a loop start. If we take a close look, hopefully you can see there that for the majority of stitches, both the bottom and the top legs have 2 different colours in them. The exception in this case is those pink bits, where both sides of the thread just happen to both be pink at the same time. Overall, this keeps the striped effect from the row by row approach, but again with the exception of that pink, each individual colour is much less defined and they blur together much more. On the next block, I stuck with the single folded strand, but this time I did the half stitches first method. Personally, I'm not a fan of what this did with this particular thread, but as I said, it is going to massively vary depending on all kinds of factors, so this might be a great method for what you're working on. The result is a combo of the mostly blurred colours from block 3, but with the added contrast of that purple on pink from block 2. So, okay, we've got a few different looks here, but they all have one thing in common, and that is stripes. Which makes sense, obviously, since we've been working row by row. So what happens if we don't do that? Here I went back to using 2 strands with the colour repeat matching up. I also went back to doing 1 full cross stitch at a time. But I changed up the order of stitches, basically putting them in at random within that 10 by 10 space and making it up as I went along. This one was actually very fun to do. And as you can see, this gives a much more varied confetti-like effect. You could take this method further and you could try stitching in little squares of 4, for example, instead of either rows or completely random. What would that look like? Well, maybe you can find out and let me know, because I do not have time to stitch up any more experiments today. But you get the idea. And in the interests of wild experimentation, I decided to go for the most jumbled result possible, just to basically see what that looked like. Here I did the single folded strand, half stitches first, and in a random order, so I just threw everything at the wall, basically. It's certainly very different to that very first orderly block we looked at. It's really funky though, I like it a lot. There are no weird splodges that stand out like the pink was in some of those other methods. It's a bit mad, but it is super fun. Okay, so by now you can see that variegated floss is going to give a very different look depending on what you do with it. And none of them are right or wrong, it's just literally a question of what you want for your project. But, just to throw a spanner in the works, I do have one last block to show you. As we've seen with this particular colourway, there's a lot of contrast between the pink and the other 2 colours, so it can be a little bit of a jarring colour change. Either of those last 2 methods does help with that issue, but I had another idea too. What would happen if you used 1 strand of variegated and 1 strand of a solid colour that goes with all of these shades? Well, this is what happens. I stuck to the full crosses row by row approach that we did in block 1, but in this case I substituted this slightly lighter shade of purple for one of the variegated strands. And as you can see, that made a huge difference to the overall effect. I actually really love how this one worked out. I love that you can still clearly see the variegation and the striping there, but the contrast is just taken way down and it's generally a much more subtle look. You might think this one is ugly and you might vastly prefer one of the options I didn't like so much. That's kind of the fun of these threads, they can do something for everybody. One last note then. I mentioned earlier that I don't really own many variegateds, and yeah, I am more of a solid colour type of girl. But the big exception for me is black work, and I think that's somewhere that these highly contrasted colourways especially do excel. I'll put up some photos of my peppermint purple Year of Blackwork stitch along from 2022, which, yes, is still incomplete in September 2023. But that's not the point. The point is that I stitched this with 1 strand of 1 variegated floss, working in small areas in a different order and direction for every block. So you can see there's no overall striping or other regular pattern, it's just a very pleasing mix of all of the shades. Love it. I'm trying to complete that one by the end of this year, but as always, we shall see. I hope that was a useful look at the different ways you can use variegated embroidery floss. Obviously a lot of caveats in terms of different flosses, levels of variegation, and even the size of your stitch area, but I did my best. Thank you as always to all of my supporters over on Ko-fi, but especially to the Stitch Squad, who this week are Stitching Liz, Marianne Johnson, Sunny, Candy Riley Pettinger, Laura Selletz, Rosalie, and Enlightened Flamingo. I'll be back soon with some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff.